Text Talks.
Hello and welcome to Text Talks. This is our second podcast on Buddhism. So Alex, take it away.
Yeah, so this is following on from last week's podcast about Buddhism and the environment, and today it's about contemporary Buddhism and ecology. So what I'm going to do is focus more on modern figures than ancient texts, because I covered all that in the last podcast, and if you haven't had a chance to listen to that, go take a look. Also, there is a lecture out now by Dr. Black about samsara, and as I said in last week's podcast, that has a lot to do with environmentalism, so it's really worth checking that out. So, where is the best place to start when I'm starting to think about contemporary Buddhism and ecology? Well, it's this idea that I mentioned very briefly last week. It's interdependence.
So we talked about, the kind of linking together, but what do you really mean by interdependence?
So, interdependence is an idea from the Mahayana school of Buddhism, and it kind of stems from the idea of shunyata, which is this idea that everything is inherently empty. Nothing has its own self-existence. Nothing exists autonomously of every other thing in the universe. And this is different from dependent origination because, well, let me give you an example. In dependent origination, we could break down a chair, and we could break it down into the seat, the back, and the forelegs. Mm-hmm. And, we could argue that there's no self because of that, because there's no one thing that makes up the chair. It's constructed of these four legs, the back, and the seat.
So, like, a leg on its own isn't a chair?
Yeah, where is the chair when it's broken down?
Yeah.
Now, the Mahayana school with Shunyata goes one step further. They say, okay, well, yeah, we agree there isn't a chair because we can break it down. But there also isn't such thing as a leg or a back or, a seat. And they break those down even further. So it's this, one step further on of this breaking down of the understanding of the universe.
So, a leg isn't a leg, it's just a plank of wood made up of atoms and carbon.
Exactly, because what makes it a leg? It's its inclusion within the chair. So it's not a leg at all. And so we can use this idea of shunyata to understand interdependence, because ultimately everything is empty. Because it sounds worse than it is.
It sounds a little nihilistic, negative.
Yeah, but it's not, because everything is empty, but that also means that everything's connected. So this can actually be seen as a really positive principle. So, for example, Katie, you're empty.
Oh.
But that's awesome, because it means that you're as important as everything else, because everything else is empty too. We're kind of all in this together, this emptiness.
Okay.
What makes you, is being connected with, you're here talking to me. You're also kind of constructed by the fact you're sat down, so you kind of rely on the chair that you're sat on.
Yeah.
That chair relies on the floor. So everything relies on you being as you are. And Alan Watts, who spoke a lot in the 50s and 60s, kind of takes this idea of interdependence and phrases it really nicely. He says that interdependence is a positive thing because the whole world then contains your signature. Mm-hmm. So this is the idea that the whole universe needs you to be just the way that you are, otherwise the universe wouldn't be the same.
Oh, okay, the universe relies on me being here because if not, it would be a completely different universe.
Exactly, but it's not just you that's important, it's everything. Mm-hmm. And this is interdependence. It's actually our lack of self-existence that makes us important.
Okay, you have brought it round.
Yeah.
It sounds a lot more positive now.
And so a really good example of this, and I told you I would get this in somewhere in the last podcast, is Indra's net. And this is the idea that in the universe is constructed of a net. Imagine this big net that goes on for infinity. And at each intersection of that net, there hangs a jewel. Now, each of those jewels reflects one another. So, one jewel has in it the reflections of every other jewel in the net, and simultaneously it reflects outwards. It's kind of this toing and froing. Mm-hmm. If we were to remove even one of those jewels in the net, the entire reflection of the net, the way all these reflections interact with each other, would completely change. And that's interdependence. Everything needs to be just as it is for the universe to be this universe.
Okay, so I get that and I see the more positive aspect. What does this understanding of interdependence mean for Buddhism's relationship with the environment?
Well, a clear example of interdependence in the environment is in terms of Thich Nhat Hanh's interbeing. And I know that Thich Nhat Hanh is on a lot of these syllabuses, so I'm going to go into it a bit. The best example of Thich Nhat Hanh's interbeing is when he writes about the cloud being in a piece of paper. And so you can actually see this full quotation in my resources I'm providing this week. But to summarise, he basically says that the paper he's writing on, these notes, that contains in it a cloud, it contains in it the trees, and he argues this because, where did the paper come from? Well, it came from a tree. Where did the tree come from? Well, it needed the rain to grow. Where did the rain come from? The cloud. And so in understanding interbeing, we can see that everything is connected, and he really focuses that on the environment. What he does with this, though, is he kind of simplifies interdependence for a Western audience. He doesn't say that you need to understand shunyata to understand what he's saying. It's not that it's not the same principle, but he never really uses the word shunyata because he's pitching to a Western audience, more so than a Zen Buddhist one or a Mahayana Buddhist one. The environmental impacts of this understanding of interbeing is that we should look after ecosystems, we should preserve habitats, we should come up with natural solutions to problems we face today. For example, beavers have been reintroduced in Scotland, and now they're actually coming to the Lake District. The idea being that they will help dam the rivers rather than humans going in and having to build dams to prevent flooding. And Thich Nhat Hanh and his organisation Plum Village are really on board with this kind of thing. For instance, they've got a sister organisation called Organic Happy Farms, where they're an organic farm association, and that demonstrates engaged Buddhism being really involved in real life issues today.
Okay, there's some really great examples. Are there any other examples of how Buddhists are engaged in the environmental crisis?
Yeah, so a really, really good one that's just come out, in the last year or so in academia is this idea of the eco-sattva. Okay. Now, the eco-sattva might sound similar to the bodhisattva, and that's because it's meant to. This is an idea developed by David Loy and Joanna Macy, who are both Zen practitioners and Buddhist practitioners, as well as environmental activists. And what they do is that they present the Mahayana tradition with a distinctly green twinge to it. In the same way that the bodhisattvas are compassionate and sought to free people from this world, from samsara, Loy and Macy use the eco-sattvas as an ideal to try and save others through promoting environmental awareness.
Okay, so they build on bodhisattvas, but are eco-sattvas Buddhist themselves?
Well, that's a hard question, because it depends really on your definition of Buddhism. The issue we find with a lot of modern Buddhist developments today is that they're kind of hybridized. They have taken into account science, or they have taken into account environmentalism. And so it's quite difficult to discern what is Buddhist and what isn't. And then also, who are we to make those calls? Who gets to decide this is a Buddhist thing and this isn't? A really good way of understanding, contemporary Buddhism is through a scholar called David McMahon. And what he does is he talks about Buddhism in terms of being Buddhist modernism. Now, Buddhist modernism isn't all Buddhism that happens today, but it is Buddhist traditions that have distinctly evolved to adapt to modern issues. So, the environmental Buddhism, so we see Thich Nhat Hanh engage Buddhism, we could say that that is a form of Buddhist modernism. And so, then the eco-sattvas could be seen as Buddhist. It just really depends on our definition of that, and Buddhist modernism helps us define Buddhism today.
Okay, so, listeners, if you listened to last week's podcast, we ended up talking a lot about how narratives, Buddhist narratives, ancient Buddhist narratives, don't actually talk about the environment that much, and actually some Buddhists use those ancient texts and adapt them to represent their kind of environmental agenda or interests. But in this podcast today, we're looking more at how actually there's a lot of environmentalism in Buddhism, but that's a more modern approach.
Yeah, so to sum up last week, basically, the texts aren't environmentalist because how could they be? Because environmentalism wasn't an issue. It doesn't mean that then contemporary Buddhists can't come along and use those texts. But as I was saying last week, it's that really being aware of, you know, when those issues started to become a problem and how people have then adapted the information. So the texts are just as important to people like Joanna Macy, David Loy, the Dalai Lama, you know, Thich Nhat Hanh. Where do you think they got their teachings from? It's from the text. You know, I showed today how interdependence and into being are connected, you know, but then it's how that information gets repackaged into this Buddhist modernism kind of thing. So, you know, into being is a perfect example. It doesn't have, you know, as difficult vocabulary. It doesn't have shunyata right in your face. I mean, it's implicit in the idea, but Thich Nhat Hanh is really clever in how he frames, you know, any form of Buddhism, meditation. You know, he has written books on like walking meditations, and he doesn't use this highly technical language we find in the ancient texts, but it still gets the same message across.
You mentioned the Dalai Lama. What does he say about environmentalism?
Well, I think a lot of the Dalai Lama's influence isn't necessarily from what he says, it's like what he does. He's just a massive advocate for environmentalism.
Okay.
There's a really great resource called the Mind and Life Conferences that have been organised since the 80s, which is the Dalai Lama every year comes into dialogue with scientists.
Oh, wow.
And they discuss issues of quantum physics, you know, from a scientific point of view and a Buddhist point of view, environmentalism, and so he's really involved in it that way. But he has also written papers and articles about Buddhism's engagement in environmentalism. He's also been involved in a lot of academic projects, like collective volumes of Buddhist academics talking about the environment. So he wrote a foreword to a book called Dharmagaya, which talks about, you know, how Buddhism and environmentalism can be seen as one religion, or themes from Buddhism that come out and are linked to environmentalism. So he's been really involved in that way, predominantly.
And the Dalai Lama, because I've read his book, The Art of Happiness.
Yeah.
And it's really nicely written. It's really accessible. So if you're looking for places to find examples to quote in exams, what he's written could be really useful.
Yeah, and the same for Thich Nhat Hanh as well. If you go on his website, plumtreevillage.org, it's got what their mission is. It's got the life story of Thich Nhat Hanh on there. It's got the Happy Farms, organic Happy Farms stuff on there. So these sources are really useful because they're contemporary writers. We can just access them straight away on the internet. You know, the difficulty when we talk about Buddhism and the environment from ancient texts is, you know, you have to read someone's translation.
Yeah.
You know, it's been translated from the Pali Canon or the Sanskrit, whereas here, you know, you can read the actual words of the Dalai Lama, or even better, you know, you can watch the Dalai Lama and Thich Nhat Hanh present on, you know, the environment. So I would say having a look on YouTube as well is a really good place to go for contemporary Buddhist views on the environment.
But they're still primary sources, you know, they're still, like the texts are primary sources going back to original Buddhist ideas. That's exactly what the Dalai Lama is giving and Thich Nhat Hanh are giving.
Yeah, exactly. They are just as valid in a lot of ways. It's just they're happening right now, but that means that they're so accessible for us. So I would really advocate anyone interested in Buddhism and environmentalism to get on the internet, really, because, you know, the texts are really useful, but the internet's just so easy for us to look at what did the Dalai Lama say in, you know, 2010 compared to now, you know, because his ideas will have changed over time. Thich Nhat Hanh, how did he start? Why did he become involved in environmentalism? And all of that information is out there. You can watch their lectures, you can read blogs about them. It's all there for you.
It's funny, the internet's kind of quite a good metaphor for interdependence.
Yeah, exactly. It's all interconnected. So, you start on a Wikipedia page, we've all been there. And then suddenly the next thing you know, you're on a scholarly article, and the next thing you know, you're watching a YouTube clip, and then the next thing you're back on a academic website, and then you're, looking at a GCSE website. It's all interconnected. And this is why Indra's Net is such a good metaphor, because it's to do with the web.
And you research it.
And I research it, yeah.
Okay, well, that's great. Really enjoyed that. And anyone who hasn't listened to last week's podcast on Buddhism and the environment, make sure to check that out because they link really well with today, as well as Dr. Black's mini lecture on samsara, again, bringing in a lot of really relevant themes.
Yeah, and if you've got any questions about anything I've covered so far or anything Dr. Black covers, please send them in.
Yeah, you can do that via Facebook with Text Talks, on Twitter at TextTalks1, or by email at inquiry.texttalks@gmail.com.
Yeah, and our next week's podcast on Buddhism is going to be about enlightenment in Mahayana Buddhism. So if you've got any questions about that, either send those in, because then I can try and respond directly to them too.
Great, well thank you Alex, thank you for listening, and we'll see you next week.